Hello, welcome to White Davy Gardening and Worm Farm. How are you guys doing? I'm just waiting a little bit for other viewers to join. Okay, so today we are going to be discussing why worms escape your bin. So, there are quite a few reasons why worms actually escape from the worm bin, and so we're going to be discussing as much of them as I can remember. Of course, if you guys can think of any that I did not mention, then it would be deeply appreciated if you would include it so that those who are just getting into worm farming or those who are considering worm farming, and if they come across this issue, then they will know how to deal with it and what sort of problems to look for. Right. Worms usually are pretty much comfortable in the worm bin, and so they will not try to escape. So once you have a situation where you see your worms are trying to escape, then it is an indication that something has gone wrong with the worm bin. So based on what we're going to be discussing here today, if you see any of these things happening, then you know what the problem is and how you can go about fixing it. So based on the topic, a lot of you guys who watch my live already are worm farmers who have been worm farming for a year or more, number of years. And so you'll be familiar with the situation. So this live is more focused on those who are just getting into worm farming or those who are just considering getting into worm farming. Right. So let's talk about why the worms try to escape the worm bin. Now, if you're just starting a worm bin, it is not uncommon for you to see worms trying to escape from the bin. They will rove about because it is a new environment to them. And so sometimes it may take the worm, they may settle down in a day. Sometimes it may take them up to 3 weeks to settle down in the worm bin. So, one thing that you can do to help these worms to settle down is to shine light on the top of the bin, and worms don't like light, and so they will tend to move away from the light. Of course, if you're going to be doing this, you have to be careful because the worms, the light will dry out the worm's skin. That's one. And two, the light can paralyze them. And depending on how close the light is to them and the type of light that you're using, if it is hot, that too will help to dry them out. So if you're going to use the light method, you have to be careful and you have to monitor what the worms are doing. So from time to time, you go back and check. You don't want to have the light there for too long because it can be harmful, not just paralyzing them, but if it is there too long and it is too close to them, then it can result in them dying. Another thing that you can do if you're just about to start your worm bin, is for those who haven't started your worm bin yet, it's a good idea to set up the worm bin before you had the worms and put some food scraps in there, allow a few days or so to pass before you had your worms. Sometimes that is not an option because you already have the worm, so you have to get them into the bin. But if you have the choice, then it is good to put the food scraps in the bin and allow the food scraps to be there for a while so that it can start breaking down and producing bacteria, because this is more attractive to the worms. The worms will eat both the bacteria and the food scraps, but when it has the bacteria, it is more attractive to them. Okay, and another reason why worms will actually try to escape your bin is if your bin is one that consistently allows light into the bin. So sometimes we may use a clear bin, and sometimes we may use one that is not transparent. Sometimes we'll use an opaque bin. Now, if light is consistently getting into the bin, and especially depending on the size of the bin and the content, how much material you have in the bin, where the worms cannot move to the inward parts and escape from the light, then your worms will try to escape. So what you can do if you have a clear bin and you see that your worms are trying to escape is, one, you can either keep it in a dark area, or if you don't have a dark area to keep it in, then you might want to use something to cover the bin that would block the light out. Another reason why worms will try to escape your bin is the moisture level in the bin. Now, your bin can be too dry, and if your bin is too dry, it can actually traumatize your worms. So your worms, depending on how dry it is, your worm can survive a very small amount of moisture in your bin, but that is not recommended, because what is going to happen when the bin becomes too dry is that the worms are going to be using their body fluid in order to moisten their skin, because the worms breathe through their skin. But if the worm skin is dry, they cannot breathe. So they will use their body fluid to moisten their skin so that they can keep breathing. This is going to dehydrate them, and it is also going to stunt their growth. So it is not a good idea to allow your bin to get too dry. Of course, from time to time we're human, so sometimes it may be the case that we forget about the worms, especially if you're just starting out with the worms. Or sometimes it may be the case that you're just so busy that you miss out on one of your times when you would look after your worms. So there are a number of reasons, but it is a good idea to keep a record of when you look after your worms. So when you're making your to-do list and you know that, okay, this particular day I look after my worms, it's nice to add that to your to-do list so that you don't forget, because that can lead to you losing your worms. So you don't want your bin to be too dry. The next thing is the bin can be too wet, and that is something you don't want either, because if your bin is too wet, then your worms will not be able to breathe properly, and it will result in them drowning. Your worm bin needs a proper airflow. So what is going to happen is, when you have too much moisture in your bin, it restricts the amount of air that passes through the bin, and that is going to be affecting your worms. So worms, though they can survive in water, so they can survive in a large body of water. The only thing is, for them to survive in moisture, a lot of moisture, or in water, the bin or the water needs to be aerated. So if you have, for example, an hydroponic system, you can actually raise worms in your hydroponic system. But the water has to be aerated, otherwise the worms will drown. Now, the right moisture content for your worms is between 70 and 80%. And you can measure that two ways. You can either use a moisture meter or you can use your hand. So, what you would want to do then is if you get a portion of the material that is in your worm bin, your bedding, or whatever it may be, and you squeeze it. Be careful if you have worms in it. But if you squeeze it and you see maybe one or two drops of water coming out, that is fine. That is the perfect moisture level that you want to be in your bin. If, however, when you squeeze it, you see a lot of water running out of the bin, then you know that you have way too much water in your bin. So, what you can do to reduce the water is you can add a lot of shredded paper or shredded cardboard to the bin. That will help, and you want to mix the paper in, or if you can get the paper on the bottom of the bin, that would work perfectly. So, so that is one method. The other thing that you can do is you can pour out the content of the bin and spread it out. Make sure it is in an environment where the worms won't escape. Spread it out and allow it to dry out a bit. Or you can turn on a fan and let the fan help to dry out the bin, and make sure you take the cover off the bin because that is going to help some of the moisture to evaporate. Now you want to make sure that you do not have any standing water in your bin. So in the bottom of your bin, make sure there's no water settled in it. So some worm bins will have holes in the bottom. There are some worm bins that do not. If your bin does not have holes in the bottom, then there's nowhere for the moisture to go. So you want to ensure that you do not add too much material that is going to create too much water in the bin. So, for example, if you are going to be feeding your worms things like melon that has practically the entire melon is water, you don't want to add so much of it to the bin that you're going to have water settling in the bin. Now, it's not important for your bins to have holes, it can have, but you can monitor the type of food and how much of it you're going to be putting into the bin so that you do not end up with too much moisture in there. So, if you're feeding things like melon or other foods that produce a lot of liquid, reduce the amount you give to your worms at each time, at each feeding, or you can make sure that you're adding the type of bedding that will absorb that liquid while you're feeding the worms. Worms, however, as I mentioned before, they need to have between 70 and 80% moisture content. They can survive on less, but if you have the right moisture content in your bin, you will notice that your worms are going to be looking fatter, they're going to be looking healthier. Now, there are some food scraps, as I mentioned, that will have a lot more moisture than others. Now, you can feed your worms food scraps or you can feed your worms dry food. If you are feeding your worms dry food, then you're going to need to add moisture, but then you're going to again monitor how much moisture you are giving your worms. Some of you who are on the live may be familiar with the fact that for a year and a half, roughly, I fed my worms finished compost, and that was all I was feeding them. Now, if you're feeding your worms finished compost, there's nothing wrong with that. That is ideal because it has all the nutrients that your worms need. But then you're going to need to add water. The only thing I find with this method is it is better if you're going to feed your worms compost that you use some other type of bedding, whether you're going to use shredded paper or you're going to use loose leaf, whatever other type of bedding, because what I find is that just using just compost, it becomes compacted. So even though I bring it to the right moisture content, because it is compacted over time, it restrict the amount of airflow that is in the bin. So again, depending on what it is that you're feeding your worms, you have to be careful of how, whether or not it can be compacted and how much moisture it can hold, whether it's going to restrict airflow, yes or no. Yes, so when I was feeding my worms the finished compost, I made sure that they have sufficient water. Of course, there are times when, oh, hi, Han White. Of course, there are times when I will forget about adding water to the bin, or even if I don't forget, sometimes I'm too busy that I don't get to tend to the worms on time, or sometimes because I have a lot of bins, sometimes I will accidentally skip a bin or stuff like that. But for the most part, you have to make sure that you maintain that moisture content. One of the things that I've noticed is that while feeding the compost, even though I had the moisture to it, they tend to be skinnier. So the moisture level in your bin is very important. I'm doing okay, Han White. How are you doing? Yes, so fourth one that I'm going to mention, which is part of the, I've just finished, well, I just touched on it a bit, is the airflow in your bin. So the worms breathe through their skin, and so you want to make sure that your bin is getting sufficient amount of air. Okay, you're doing well. That's good. Sorry about that. Yes, so you want to make sure that you have good airflow in your bin, because the worms breathe through their skin and they have five hearts that help to circulate the blood, and you know that the blood is what carries the oxygen around their bodies. So you have to make sure that you have very good airflow. Hi, Cece. Hi, Mom. How are you guys? Yes, so airflow is very, very important in your bin. Sometimes your bin might be restricted in terms of airflow depending on where you keep your bin. It depends on the amount of holes in your bin. It depends on the content that you have in your bin. So there are many things that can affect your airflow. Okay, you're doing fine. That's good. Yeah, so there are many things that can affect your airflow in the bin. When your bins are outdoor, they tend to have better airflow than when they are indoors. So if you have the option of keeping your bins outdoor, then that's good. But it doesn't really matter where your bin is, you can have sufficient airflow through your bin. You just have to make sure that you have the proper holes in your bin to increase airflow. And if your bin is very deep, like for example, a very large garbage bin, some of them might be 3 feet deep or more, then you want to ensure that you create more holes in it. The deeper it is and the narrower the bin is, the more holes you're going to need to have in there to ensure that the worms are getting sufficient air. Now, the next reason why worms will try to escape your bin is the food supply. So, worms can eat anything from 0 to their full body weight in a day. That depends on how ideal the condition is in their bin. Now, most of the conditions in the bin we can control, but there are some things that we just cannot control. For example, the barometric pressure in the bin or in the environment around the bin, that we cannot control, but the amount of food that our worm have, we can control. And so we want to control how much food we give our worms and how often we feed our worms. Now, if you're feeding food scraps and you're feeding dry food, the results will be different in the appearance of your worms. As I mentioned before, the moisture level does play a part in how your worms will look. Food scraps has the both the nutrients and the moisture that you need to keep your bins wet, depending on the type of food scraps that you're using. For dry food, it has all the nutrients the worms need, but then it does not have the moisture. So you're going to have to make sure that you had sufficient moisture. Now, worms feed at different rate, and you may have more than one bin. One bin might feed faster than another, and sometimes the amount of food that you're going to give your worms, you have to monitor the habit of your worms, of each worm bin, to see how much they eat in a day or how much they eat in a week. How much worms do you have? And based on the amount of worms that you have, and based on how fast or how slow they eat, that is what is going to determine how much food you give your worms. If you are someone who has a lot of time and you can feed your worms daily, then you just want to give them just enough food that they can eat within a day. If you don't have time to feed them daily, then you may choose to feed them 1 or 2 times for the week. So you want to make sure that you had enough food for them to eat within that period of time. Of course, if you are going on vacation, you may choose to feed them more food than you would normally do if you are going to be around. And where that is concerned, if you are going to be out of town for a while and you would be missing out on the time when you would regularly feed your worm, it is a good idea, if possible, to feed them something in addition to the regular food that you would give them. For example, food scraps, it would be nice to give them dry food that is not going to be sitting there for a long period of time and creating things like mold or mildew in the worm bin. And it may go sour and cause your bin to become acidic, which we're going to be discussing a little bit further. So if you're going to be out of town for any extended period of time, adding dry food to the mix is a good idea. Or what you can do if you don't have dry food, say for example, compost or finished compost, or maybe you feed the worms oats or cornmeal, whatever the case may be. If you don't have that type of food, then you can add things like dried leaves and more bedding to the bin, because the worms will feed on that as well. What you don't want is to have so much food in the bin that it is going to go bad and create and cause molds or mildew to develop in your bin. So you don't want to overfeed your bin, because once the food scrap starts to go bad, then it is going to be affecting your worms. Now, if the bin gets breed more bacteria because of the amount of food in there, that is fine, because the worms love the bacteria. But then too much food in the bin can lead to a condition that I'm going to be discussing shortly, and that is the level of acidity in your worm bin. So you don't want to feed too much food scraps, because one, once it starts to go bad, it is going to become acidic. And once it becomes acidic, the worms do not like acidic condition, and so they're going to try to escape from the bin. Now, worms can eat acidic food, but it is not recommended that you give it to them, but they can eat it. If you're going to be feeding your worms acidic food, make sure that you give it to them only in small quantities. You don't want to give them so much that it is going to make your bin acidic. And at the same time, as I mentioned before, too much food scraps in the bin can make it acidic as well. So there are certain things that you can do if your bin is becoming acidic. For one, you can remove some of the food scraps that is in the bin, but there are other options that works better than removing the food scraps from the bin. You can use pH buffer to yes, you can add pH buffer to your bin. Now, some pH buffer that you can add to your bin includes things like diatomaceous earth. You can use dried oyster shell or dried crushed eggshells. You can use granulated limestone or dolomite. Now, if you guys know of any other type of pH buffer that can be added to the bin, please feel free to share. One thing though you need to be careful of if you're going to be using a pH buffer to your worm bin, make sure you do not use harsh cool chemicals because that will kill your worms. So it will control the pH in your worms, but it will kill your worms, which will defeat the purpose of you trying to monitor the pH in the bin in the first place. So don't use harsh cool chemicals in your bin. Now, if your worm bin does not have the proper airflow, and especially if you are overfeeding your bin, this can lead to an acidic environment because as this food break down and it is not getting enough air, it is going to become anaerobic, and once it is anaerobic, then it is going to lead to an acidic condition in your worm bin. So that is something else that you need to avoid. Now, the next thing that will cause worms to try to escape from your worm bin is your temperature. To some extent, we have control over the temperature that our worms are exposed to. We can either choose to keep our worms indoors or outdoors. And if we experience winter conditions, then it might be a good idea to put your worms in location where you can control the temperature. Let's see. And why it says, yes, I think that is what is happening in my bin, overfeeding, but that won't stop. Okay. Yes, and I know that sometimes depending on where you are living, you might not have a lot of space where you can store your food scraps in a separate location from the worm bin. So sometimes that can become a problem storing it, and because of that, sometimes some worm farmers will just, every time they have the food scraps, they will just add it to the bin. So where possible, one method that we can use to control that is if we have access to a container that we can keep underneath the worm bin or some little corner where it is out of the way, then we can put the food scraps in there and use it as necessary. But sometimes that is not an option. Let's see. So, and why it says I just had a finish composed to it. Oh, okay. Yes. So temperature plays a big part in how active your worms are, how well your worms will perform. So the temperature requirement for worms varies with the species that you're raising. So if you're raising things, worms like the red wigglers, they like temperatures between 55 and 77 degrees Fahrenheit. And for the European night crawlers, they like temperatures between 55 and 78 Fahrenheit. They can stand temperatures as low as 45 degrees Fahrenheit, but the ideal temperature is between 55 and 78 for the red wigglers and the European night crawlers. The Canadian night crawlers, they don't have a wide window that they can tolerate. So they like between 35 and 48 degrees Fahrenheit. And if you're going to have them for a pretty long time, and if you don't have an environment where you can keep them cool, keeping them in the fridge might be a good idea. But then, how many are you going to be raising that you can actually keep them in your fridge? That is another thing to consider. So, of all the composting worms, the depending on where you're living, the Canadian night crawlers are the least feasible one to raise because the amount of care that they actually require. So they are the first to start leaving the bin when things are not going well. Now, the African night crawlers, they can stand temperature between 60 and 86 degrees Fahrenheit, but the ideal temperatures for the African night crawlers is between 70 and 85 degrees Fahrenheit. Blue worms, they survive, or the ideal temperature for them is between 70 and 80 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 21 to 26 degrees Celsius. Oh, hi, on the rock and in the soil. Oh, you changed your name, did you, Michael? Yes. So, what you will notice if the temperature is too hot is that your worms are going to slow down, and depending on how hot it is, they may die. If it is too cold, the same thing is going to happen. They're going to slow down or they're going to die, depending on how cold it is. Now, some of these worms can survive a little bit hotter temperatures than is recommended, or a little bit colder temperature than is recommended, but they will perform best at the temperatures that I just mentioned. Now, if the worms are cool, then they're fine. If they're too cold, you don't want that because depending on where you are, they may freeze to death. Okay, that is your business name. Okay, yes. So you just want to have the ideal temperature. Now, worms, if you have a lot of moisture in your bin, the temperature will change, even the moisture level, the moisture in your bin. So when the time is hot, your bin tends to dry out more. When the time is cold, the bin tends to maintain the moisture longer. And so when you're watering your bin, you want to keep that in mind so that you don't overwater or you don't underwater your bin. Sometimes you might end up having to water your bin more, or you might end up having to water your bin less. Now, when the environment is moist, for example, when it is rainy, worms tend to wander a lot. Even if they're not leaving the bin, they will wander around in the bin. You will see them on the sides of the bin, the lid of the bin. Sometimes they will escape the lid of the bin too. Because what is happening is, one, the barometric pressure changes, and the worms are very sensitive to even the slightest bit of change in temperature and in barometric pressures. So once there is any form of change, they will be aware of that. And then when it is rainy, what's going to happen is that it's going to be overcast, which means that the sunlight is not going to be as intense. So if you have your bins outdoors, they're going to be feeling freer to rove about. One, it is moist, which means that their skin is not going to be drying out as fast as if it was sunny. So that too is going to encourage them to try to rove about. And even in your worm bin, even if your worm bin is indoors, the moisture that is in the air, they can sense that. And so that is why you will see them while your bin is indoors and it is rainy, they're still roving about on the sides of the bin or on the lids of the bin when otherwise they would not have. Because they can stay on the sides and the lids of your bin longer because the air is moister than usual. So where that is concerned, when it rains, there's not much that we can do to control that situation. But that is one of the reasons why the worm sometimes will try to escape from your bin. It's not that something is wrong with the bin when it rains, as long as it's not raining inside the bin. But it's just that the condition is more ideal, more suitable for them, and so they will feel freer to rove about. Now, the next thing that will cause worms to escape your bin is the amount of space that is in your bin. So it is recommended that for every pound of worms that you have a surface area of at least 1 square foot. Some people will allow 2 pounds of worms per square foot, but you can have a bin with just 1 square foot and have even 5 pounds of worm in there. But that is dependent on the content, the amount of material that you have in the worm bin. Because the more material that you have in the worm bin, the more space is there for the worms to move up and down. So they don't have to be bundling themselves together all the time. Hi, Chain Breaker. How are you? So the worms don't mind being bundled together, but then they want to move about. So they need space. Now, the more space the worms have, the more they're going to reproduce, and especially if they have the food and the moisture and the temperature and stuff like that. As long as condition is ideal and they have sufficient space, then it is the more that they are going to be reproducing. The less space they have is the less they're going to be reproducing. And in fact, if they don't have sufficient space, they are going to be controlling. Oh, hi, Kozar. Yeah, man, time to go. Yes, so the more space they have, the more they're going to try to reproduce. Oh, thank you. It's nice that you could join us too. Yes, so the more space they have, the more they're going to try to reproduce, but the less space they have, they're going to start regulating their rate of reproduction. And not only that, if there's too much of them in the bin, they're going to try to escape so that the younger ones can. Oh, you like that catchphrase? Okay. Yes. So the less space they have, the more they're going to try to escape the bins because they are going to try to make space for the younger worms. So space is very, very important for your worms. So when you're buying your bin, consider the amount of worms that you would like to have. Consider how much space you have in terms of can you have a lot of bins, or is it that you have space where you can have just one large bin? But then you don't really have to worry about the worm population too much unless you find that you're having too little bit of worms in your bin. Other than that, you don't really have to worry about the space, especially for some who might just want to have 1 or 2 worm bin. Then the worms are going to be regulating their population. So it's not the case where you're going to have to go and keep on getting more bin. No, you can, whatever amount of bin you have, if you don't want to have a lot of bins, that is okay because the worms are going to be regulating their population based on the size bins that you have. And the last point to discuss regarding what will cause worms to try to escape your bin is vibrations. Worms, like I mentioned, they're sensitive to changes. And if the worms are in an environment where there is constant vibration, maybe you're using a table saw on a wooden floor or whatever it is that is causing vibration, the worms can sense that and they will try to leave your bin if the vibration is something that is happening regularly. So occasionally, no, they won't try to leave the bin. But if it is something that is there consistently or very often, then they will try to leave the bin. So you want to try to keep your bins in an environment where the worms won't be exposed to too much vibration. So again, these are the reasons why worms try to leave your bin. They will leave because of vibration, because of space, because of temperature, because of moisture, because of consistent light shining into the worm bin, because there is too many worms in the bin. They might leave because of the food that is in the bin, the acidity in the bin, whether they have enough food, yes or no. So these are reasons why your worms will try to leave the bin. If you know of any other reason why worms try to leave the bin that I did not mention, it would be nice if you could share so that those who are new to worm farming will know what to look for if they see their worm escaping. And if you have experienced any of this happening in your worm bin, please feel free to share and share what you did to overcome this problem. Let's see. Corsa says, sorry I joined late. Did you mention pH as another factor? Yes, I did mention pH because worms like a pH between 6 and 7. So anything below that or anything above that, especially below that, can be very detrimental to your worm. So between 6 and 7 is ideal. Let's see. On the rock says, if you want to build a population, 250 per square feet makes them think they are dying out and will breed like crazy. Okay, that's good. Good information. Thanks for sharing that. So for you guys who are new to worm farming or you're considering how you can increase your population, that is a good idea from Michael. 250 per square foot. Let's see. Chainbreaker says, I never knew that worms are sensitive to vibration. Yes, they are very sensitive to vibration, which is why when you are going fishing and if you don't have bait, you can actually take a stick that is actually rough and take another stick and just push the end of the stick in the ground. I don't remember what that. They actually have the tools now made from wood that they used to do that. I don't remember what it is called. Oh, Russell is here. Maybe he can remind me what that is called, where you put that stick in the ground and use another stick to rub it, and that vibration will cause the worms to come out of the ground. Yeah, so vibrations do affect worms. Yes, toxic bins or airflow, that will definitely affect your worm bin. And some worms are able to break down certain harmful chemicals that are found in the soil, but they are not able to break down every form of harmful chemical that is found in the soil. So they're good at breaking down heavy metal in the soil. So it is a good idea not to feed them harmful chemicals thinking that they're going to be able to break that down, because that can cause them to escape the bin or die off. So we have to be careful with that as well. Let's see. Russell says, when I'm having my worm bread, it is done with very tightly packed worms relative to the size of the bin.